After more than a decade of development followed by months of uncertainty, the U.S. Air Force officially has a new air superiority fighter making its way towards service in Boeing's F-47. This new jet, developed within the broader Next Generation Air Dominance program, is meant to be much more than just another stealth fighter, or even potentially the world's first sixth-generation fighter. After all, that title is pretty meaningless until we actually define what sixth generation means. No, what really makes this new stealth fighter so special is the jet that it's meant to replace, and the extreme capability set required to do so. Because the F-47 is meant to unseat the reigning king of the skies, F-22 Raptor, as the new, most capable air superiority fighter on the planet. A jet that's so capable that training exercises have to stack the deck against it just to give other fighters a chance, and so dominant that wins against it remain so rare, even with those uneven rules of engagement, that news outlets report breathlessly about any jet that manages to squeak out a win against it. That's right, Boeing's F-47 isn't just meant to provide America with a new generation of air superiority platforms. It's meant to replace what may be the most legendary stealth fighter in history. And those are some very big wings to fill. So let's look at some of the questions you've asked about the F-47, and I'll do my best to give you the answers. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power.
Box one.
Last Friday, President Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced that the contract for America's next air superiority fighter has been awarded to Boeing, providing the firm with the estimated $20 billion it needs to complete design maturation and early production prep work that it's going to take to get these jets rolling out of Boeing's new classified combat aircraft factory in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, we've spent a lot of time on this channel discussing the Next Generation Air Dominance program, from the classified 2014 report that spurred this effort to the X-plane program that saw entries from at least Lockheed Martin and Boeing, overseen by combined leadership out of the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, and DARPA. So this time, I thought it could be fun to do something a bit different and let you, the audience, decide what we cover in this video. And in order to pull that off, I asked for questions on the community tab of our YouTube channel and on my Twitter or X account. So without further ado, let's dive into the most pressing questions you have about Boeing's new F-47 and the future of American air combat superiority, starting with one that's been asked more than any other. Why Boeing? Now, it's no secret that Boeing has suffered a steady stream of scandals and controversies in recent years, leaving many to assume this fighter contract would most likely go to Lockheed Martin. But it's important to remember that Boeing's not exactly a slouch in the stealth development department. While many are familiar with Boeing's X-32, which competed and lost against Lockheed Martin's X-35, it was far from the firm's first foray into low observable aviation. Between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, the two companies merged in '97, today's Boeing has a history of stealth that dates back further than any company on the planet, thanks to Boeing's Model 853-21 Quiet Bird that saw development work in the early 1960s. In the 1990s, McDonnell Douglas and then Boeing were behind the development of the extremely exotic YF-118G bird of prey, followed by the X-36 tailless fighter demonstrator that all but certainly helped to inform today's tailless F-47. In the 2000s, Boeing built and tested the X-45 and X-46 stealth UCAVs for the Air Force and the Navy respectively, and today continues development on other stealthy drone platforms like the MQ-25 Stingray drone refueler and the MQ-28 Ghostbat loyal wingman drone. And of course, despite Boeing's troubles with commercial aircraft and even defense acquisitions like the long-troubled KC-46 Pegasus, most people tend to gloss over Boeing's successful and ongoing fighter programs like the broadly capable FA-18 Super Hornet. its sibling, the EA-18G Growler, and maybe most notable of all, the F-15EX, which might just be the most capable fourth-generation fighter in the world today. These jets began their design lineage under the McDonnell Douglas banner, but the most modern and capable incarnations are distinctly Boeing products, at least in the modern sense, and have proven themselves both in testing and in combat on more than one occasion. But aside from Boeing's respectable fighter chops, it also seems likely that the need to maintain a broad fighter industrial base may have played a role in Boeing securing this contract. You see, with Super Hornet production expected to sunset in 2027, and F-15EX production unlikely to extend too much further than that, the NGAD contract will keep Boeing in the fighter business at a time when there really only are 3 firms left that can actually compete in this space for the United States. With Lockheed Martin building and sustaining F-35s for decades to come, and Northrop Grumman building and sustaining B-21 Raiders for decades to come, Boeing will now also receive a steady flow of defense revenue through the production and sustainment of the F-47, ensuring there are at least 3 competitors for future rounds of fighter contracts to come. And Boeing worked hard to make themselves an enticing choice here. While we don't know much about their actual fighter design, we do know that Boeing has invested right around $1.8 billion into the construction of a new 1.1 million square foot classified combat aircraft facility in St. Louis, which is set to open in 2026, followed by a new post-assembly center meant for finishing work built right down the street. And out in Mesa, Arizona, Boeing's building a new advanced composites fabrication center that could be vital for the production of these new stealth jets. And of course, while we know very little about the actual fighter designs proposed by Lockheed Martin and Boeing, we can assume that the designs themselves played the biggest role in this contract decision, with that assumption being that Boeing proposed the better fighter, and its new production infrastructure was just there to help sweeten the deal. All right, on to the next question from Moronius the Elder. What are the known requirements for this fighter? Well, the Next Generation Air Dominance program that resulted in the F-47 has been billed from its onset as a family of systems, with this program also encompassing AI-piloted wingman drones, known within the Air Force as collaborative combat aircraft, and new long-range air-to-air weapons, like the Air Force's still very secretive AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile. To some extent, this approach to development points to a very different concept of operations for the F-47, as it won't fly out on its own, but rather as an entire formation unto itself, leveraging those drone wingmen to engage adversaries from multiple vectors at once, while using those drones to extend the range of both sensors and weapon systems to allow for that coveted first shot opportunity, or the ability to take down an enemy fighter before it ever even knows you're there. But beyond the F-47's ability to coordinate and control AI-piloted CCA drones, the jet itself is expected to best the F-22 Raptor in several important metrics, while likely also falling short of the Raptor's performance in a few others. And this really all comes down to the inherent compromises that come with fighter design. It's impossible to make a single aircraft that's good at everything. And in fact, doing one thing well almost always comes at the expense of doing something else quite so well. And advanced as the F-47 may be, it is no exception to this rule. 2 things we know we can expect out of this fighter are larger payloads and longer ranges. Both elements the Air Force has placed a significant emphasis on as it's turned its focus toward the possibility of a conflict with China. As the Air Force laid out in its 2050 report outlining its predictions for the future of air combat in the next quarter century or so, forward air bases will be under constant risk of airstrikes from Chinese cruise ballistic and hypersonic missiles, and refueling tankers will have to operate further away than ever before as new surface-to-air missiles begin receiving target data from satellites high overhead, making intercepts at 1,000-mile ranges a sudden possibility. Both of these anticipated realities dictate the need for a fighter that can operate over much greater ranges than today's Raptor, while delivering larger payloads to have sufficient battlefield effect despite the time it takes to cover all that distance. So let's toss this question into the mix as well from Mr. G Time. What features facilitate increases in range? Now, more fuel and larger payloads pretty invariably means a larger aircraft, but the Air Force has been clear that they also expect these jets to operate from more austere environments than today's stealth fighters, with less specialized equipment and personnel necessary for combat operations. And this points directly toward the Air Force's increasing focus on ACE operations, which is short for Agile Combat Employment. This effectively amounts to operating American tactical aircraft from a larger number of more broadly dispersed and often pretty austere airstrips, giving adversaries more targets to contend with as fighters scramble from highways and hasty airstrips all throughout the region. In order to make this possible, the F-47 will have to be less maintenance reliant than previous stealth aircraft, especially when it comes to its radar-absorbent skin. Polymer-based radar-absorbent material can be very susceptible to damage from heat and friction, both of which are inherent to sustained supersonic flight. So the RAM coating on the F-47 will need to be stronger and more resilient than ever, as today's F-22, for instance, sometimes requires lengthy RAM maintenance that involves wearing hazmat gear to scrape the old damaged RAM off, reapplying that material, and then waiting days for it to cure. This new jet is also expected to offer a big boost in sensor reach and sensor fusion capabilities, drawing in data from sensors throughout the battlefield, including on those CCA drones, and then fusing them all into a single battlefield perspective that'll provide pilots with something of a god's eye view of the fight. And maybe most widely expected, it's also going to offer a significant boost in all aspect stealth, delivered at least in part by the omission of the fighter's standing vertical tail surfaces. And that brings me to some of the most common questions I've been asked about Boeing's design, starting with this one from Corey Fry 9633. Maneuverability, can it survive and outperform in close quarters engagements, or is the sole purpose to be a manager from long range? And then the even more commonly asked question, this one from Santacar, why does it have canards if they're bad for stealth, at least allegedly? Okay, let's start with the maneuverability question and then work our way to the canards, because as some of you already know, asking about canards and stealth is an excellent way to pick a fight in any aviation subreddit. Now, President Trump did reference maneuverability among the capabilities he said set this new fighter apart from anything else in the sky. But to be clear, the president is a businessman politician and not an aeronautical engineer, fighter jet expert, or aviation historian. And in reality, it seems exceedingly likely that this new fighter will be less maneuverable than the Raptor it replaces. And not just because of the eliminated tail surfaces. As we already discussed in this video, aircraft design is a constant exercise in compromise, which almost always means sacrificing one thing in favor of another. This is particularly true when it comes to balancing stealth against aerobatic performance. I'm going to quote Lieutenant Colonel Randy Gordon, an Air Force test pilot, an engineer, and an F-22 pilot, from a lecture he gave about the Raptor at MIT in 2021. Quote, "The Raptor is this constant fight between the double E guys, electrical engineers, and aeronautical engineers." He went on to say, now this is not Wonder Woman's airplane. It's not like you can just become invisible and no one can see you, but it is very, very hard to see on radar. But there's a challenge in that. When you make an airplane that looks like this, which the double E guys tend to like, the aero engineer guys tend to hate, because it makes the airplane unstable. In broad strokes, improved stealth often comes at the expense of improved aerobatic performance, as the traits that benefit one tend to detract from the other. But of course, there are ways to compensate for or offset some of those losses. One way to increase maneuverability, in at least some regards, would be to incorporate thrust vector control, or engine nozzles that can orient the thrust of the engines somewhat independent of the airframe itself. And of course, the inclusion of canards forward of the wings, assuming they are indeed moving control surfaces, could have a huge impact on the aircraft's maneuverability. But that huge impact would come at the expense of at least some degree of stealth in most circumstances. And that's what makes the inclusion of canards in these renders such an interesting development. For years now, we've been told that the NGAD fighter would prioritize low observability over maneuverability, with the Congressional Research Service going so far as to say the new fighter may be more like the B-21 than like the F-22. But canards, while beneficial for generating lift and low-speed aerobatics, seem to run counter to that design philosophy. Of course, like most arguments on the internet, however, the canards debate, which has largely been centered around China's J-20 in the past, has long since been robbed of all its nuance, with one side arguing that canards can never be stealthy, and the other arguing that their impact on stealth isn't pronounced at all. Reality, of course, falls somewhere in between. The negative impact canards can have on stealth comes in a variety of forms. Canards offer additional leading edges to reflect radar waves, and their ability to move creates edge alignment issues. And of course, the gaps and seams inherent to moving control surfaces can also negatively impact stealth. But it's not all bad news. As Tyler Rogaway pointed out over at the Warzone, the Joint Strike Fighter program assessed the impact canards might have on a stealth fighter design as notable, but not really any worse than the inclusion of a traditional empennage or tail section with horizontal stabilizers. And some of the traditional issues with canards could even be offset thanks to newly emerging technologies like morphing structures that adjust mechanically under and outer skin, so to speak, so as to avoid gaps and seams. Now, this is a technological realm Boeing has explored with some success in the past in applications like jet nozzle chevrons. Put simply, canards can definitely have a negative impact on stealth, but stealth is not an on-off switch. There are practically countless variables at play when it comes to determining an aircraft's radar return, and there are ceaseless technological efforts aimed at curtailing the negative impact of improved aerobatics in stealth fighters. To be frank, it's just a little early to be sounding any alarms regarding the little we've seen of this aircraft's design, especially when we've yet to even see all of it. Both the YF-22 and X-35 saw significant changes as they matured into the operational F-22 and F-35 we know today, and the F-47 is unlikely to be any different. So, with that in mind, I'm going to withhold my judgment about those canards and whether the benefit of including them outweighs the cost until we know more about this jet. But I will note that the inclusion of canards might offer some semblance of an answer to this question from Justin Dulaney7152, who asked, will this design primarily focus on beyond visual range at the sacrifice of maneuverability in hopes that stealth will prevail? Because prior to seeing these new renders, the assumption was that the F-47 will prioritize beyond visual range engagements using its drone wingmen and improved onboard sensors to leverage extremely long-range air-to-air missiles like the aforementioned AIM-260, all to get that first shot opportunity. But the inclusion of canards may suggest an aircraft that's at least a little bit more dynamic than we previously expected, and it may be able to slug it out in close quarters more effectively than I might have otherwise presumed. But the extremely aerobatic AIM-9X Sidewinder will still likely be doing the really heavy lifting when it comes to winning a close quarters fight. Alright, let's move on to the next question from John Boy. Engines, what's the propulsion, thrust class, adaptive cycle, or no? Now, as we've discussed in the past, advanced turbofan technology is one realm where the US maintains a commanding lead over its adversaries in Russia and China, both of which are continuing to work toward fielding their own turbofan equivalents of the Raptor's F-119 that America's been operating since the 1990s. But that advantage is quickly waning. So in order to maintain the advantage, the Air Force has invested a total of some $7 billion into the development and maturation of a new generation of adaptive cycle turbofan engines, purpose-built for advanced stealth applications. These engines, being developed by GE and Pratt & Whitney, function in different operational modes depending on the pilot's needs, sort of like fighter jet VTEC for my car guys out there, with higher efficiency, lower power settings for standard cruising to extend range and loiter time, and a higher thrust, lower efficiency mode for when max power is called for. Now, GE's experimental XA100 engine, for instance, reported as much as a 20% increase in thrust over the F-35's class-leading F-135 turbofan, along with as much as a 50% increase in loiter time. As we speak, both engine manufacturers are building their XA102 and XA103 engines to compete for the opportunity to power the F-47, and likely the Navy's forthcoming F/A-XX fighter as well. And while we're talking about F/A-XX, let's discuss this question. From BM Lynch, how do we expect the F/A-XX fighter to be different? Do we know what the timeline is for that contract announcement? Is Northrop still in the running? Now, as I record this, it was announced that the contract to build the Navy's new 6th-generation fighter, maturing under the same next-generation air dominance umbrella, but generally known as F/A-XX, may be announced as early as later this week. Lockheed Martin has publicly bowed out of this competition, leaving it down to Boeing and Northrop Grumman. Now, interestingly, a lot of people thought Boeing had a better shot at winning the F/A-XX contract than the Air Force's NGAD one. And honestly speaking, F/A-XX could be anyone's game, anyone being Northrop or Boeing. But it might be a tougher road for Boeing, as the Air Force and Navy have been clear that they don't want to develop the same aircraft for both branches' needs, something commonly seen as part of the reason the F-35 program's budget swelled the way it did. Of course, things can change though, and the Navy might be just as taken with Boeing's proposal as the Air Force was. But as it stands, our understanding is that the Navy wants to pursue the development of their own purpose-built carrier fighter that's independent of Air Force efforts. But thanks to modern modular systems, these two different aircraft may share some onboard systems in common. Now, that would allow for specialized airframes for each branch while bringing down the overall cost of developing each. The adaptive cycle engines in development for NGAD, for instance, are likely to find a home in F/A-XX, and there are sure to be other similar systems. But right now, it's down to Boeing and Northrop, and anyone's game. And we won't really know what sets them apart until we find out about the winner of that contract. All right, let's close with one more question. This one from Cactus Pete. What's the latest on lasers being used for anti-aircraft warfare from the platform? Seems like a big boost from costly standard missiles if the engines can power it. Now, one of the biggest benefits of those adaptive cycle engines I told you about is their cooling capacity, which GE estimates as roughly twice that of today's most advanced turbofan engines. Now, cooling capacity has actually been a limiting factor in electrical power generation in modern fighters, because these engines can run hotter and produce more electricity, but doing so could actually damage the fuselage of the aircraft. An engine with twice the cooling could theoretically produce twice the electrical power, and that would be vital for directed energy weapons like lasers. But there are some distinct challenges associated with using lasers as offensive weapons. Power production, even with such powerful engines, could be a huge problem. But even if that's overcome, thermal blooming and atmospheric dissipation limit the efficacy of even high-powered lasers at long range inside the Earth's atmosphere. Lasers can, however, be used for other applications, like infrared countermeasures, where you dazzle the IR sensor of an inbound missile to make it lose its track, or even more exotically, to superheat the air and produce what's called a laser-induced plasma filament hologram. In effect, this technology, which the Navy patented back in 2018, could allow a fighter to produce a superheated plasma hologram of the jet's own heat signature in midair, fooling inbound heat-seeking missiles into pursuing the hologram rather than the jet. But this technology, as far as we know, has yet to leave the laboratory. So at least for now, I'd say lasers are unlikely to be a prominent part of the F-47's offensive capabilities, but may yet find a place among its defensive ones. Now, this video's already gone on pretty long, but there's so much more to talk about when it comes to the F-47, and things will only get more interesting as more information is disclosed. And of course, even more to talk about once the Navy's F/A-XX contract is awarded. So rest assured, we will be on top of all of the latest in these fighter programs as they mature towards service. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you'll never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.